The soldier beneath my hands was 19 years old, and I was watching the light leave his eyes while I worked on someone else. His name was Varro. He had shown me a pic of his sisters 3 days ago, 2 girls with dark hair and gap-toothed smiles, and he had told me their names, and I had already forgotten them because there was no room in my mind for names anymore. No space for anything except the work. The endless, terrible work of trying to hold back death with sutures and counterceptic, and hands that had not stopped shaking in 9 months. "Medic," he whispered. His voice was wet, bubbling, the sound of lungs filling with blood. "Medic, please." I did not look at him. I could not look at him. My hands were buried in the chest cavity of another man. Older, a sergeant, someone whose survival might keep a squad together, might preserve some fragment of unit cohesion in the chaos that had become our existence. The sergeant's heart was visible, beating in stuttering rhythms beneath my fingers, and I was trying to clamp an artery that had been severed by shrapnel, trying to stop the bleeding that would kill him in minutes if I failed. Varro would die in minutes, regardless of what I did. The wound in his abdomen had opened him from hip to ribs, had spilled things onto the mud that should never see daylight, and there was no surgery in the Imperium that could put him back together. He was dead. He simply had not finished dying. "Please." His hand found my ankle, fingers weak, grip failing. "Please, I don't want to die. I don't want to die." I kept working. The sergeant's artery slipped beneath my clamp, and I cursed, and I tried again, and the blood kept coming, hot and red and endless. Varro stopped speaking. His hand fell away from my ankle. I heard the breath leave his body, a long, rattling exhalation that seemed to carry something more than air, something essential and irreplaceable, draining away into the mud of a world whose name I had already forgotten. I did not stop working. I could not stop working. There were 17 more wounded waiting behind me, 17 more bodies torn open by a war that had no end, and no purpose, and no mercy. And if I stopped to mourn every death I witnessed, I would never move again. The sergeant lived. I closed his chest with crude stitches that would scar terribly if he survived long enough to scar, and I pumped him full of stims that would keep his heart beating until the evacuation Valkyries arrived. And then I moved to the next body, and the next, and the next. My hands never stopping, my mind never resting, my soul, if I still had one, retreating somewhere deep inside where the screaming could not reach it. This is what it means to be a medic in the Astra Militarum. This is the truth they do not tell you when they pin the Crimson Cross to your uniform and hand you a kit full of tools that are never enough, supplies that are always running out, hope that was exhausted long before you ever reach the front. You do not save lives. You choose deaths. I was not always this thing that moves through the aftermath of battle, with blood beneath its fingernails and emptiness behind its eyes. I was a person once, with a name that meant something, with dreams that extended beyond the next triage, with a belief that the work I did mattered, that each life I saved was a victory against the darkness that pressed in from all sides. My name is Kalen Druce. I trained at the Medici Collegium on Vantris III, learned my craft in sterile chambers, with proper equipment and adequate supplies, with instructors who spoke of healing as a sacred duty and the preservation of life as the highest calling a servant of the Emperor could pursue. I believed them. I believed every word. Then they shipped me to the 47th Kraken Rifles, and I learned what medicine means when the patient is the Imperium and the treatment is war. The first man I lost was named Torren. He had taken a lasbolt through the shoulder, a survivable wound, a wound I had trained for, a wound I should have been able to treat with the contents of my kit and the skills I had spent years acquiring. But my kit was already half empty from the engagement that morning, and the counterseptic I needed had been requisitioned by another company, and the evacuation that should have come in 20 minutes did not come for 6 hours, and by the time the Valkyries finally descended, Torren had slipped into a fever that no amount of prayer or medicine could break. He died holding my hand. He called me by his mother's name. He asked me to tell her that he had been brave. I did not know his mother. I did not know where she lived or how to reach her. I did not even know which world Torren had come from, which hive or agri-settlement or void station had produced this young man who now lay cooling in the mud of a planet that did not know his name and would not remember his passing. I wept for him. I wept for hours, alone in the ruins of a building that had been a church before the shelling started, and I swore that I would never lose another patient, that I would fight for every life entrusted to my care, that I would be better, work harder, pray more fervently to the Emperor who watched over all his servants. That was 9 months ago. 9 months, 47 engagements, and more deaths than I can count. I stopped counting after the first 100. I stopped weeping after the first 50. I stopped believing after the first 30, though I did not admit it to myself until much later. Until the night I realized that I could no longer remember Torren's face, that the first man I had failed to save had become nothing more than a name attached to a lesson. This is what the Guard does to those who would heal. It teaches us that our purpose is not to preserve life, but to manage death, to sort the wounded into categories that determine their fate, to look at a man and calculate in seconds whether his survival serves the Imperium's interests, or whether the resources required to save him would be better spent elsewhere. Triage. The word comes from ancient Terran tongues, from a time before the Emperor, before the Imperium, before humanity had spread across the stars and learned that there would never be enough medicine, enough time, enough hands to save everyone who needed saving. It means to sort, to choose, to play God with lives that are not yours to give or take. I have become very good at triage. I have become so good that I can look at a wounded soldier and know within heartbeats whether he will live or die, whether his wounds are survivable or merely prolonged, whether the breath he draws will be followed by another, or whether it will be his last. I can make these calculations while shells fall around me, while lasfire screams overhead, while men scream for help that I cannot give because my hands are already occupied with someone whose odds are marginally better. I am told this is a gift. I am told that my ability to remain calm in the chaos, to think clearly when others panic, to make impossible decisions without hesitation. These are the qualities that make a good field medic, the traits that the Medicae Collegium tried to instill in all its students, but that only a few truly possess. I do not feel gifted. I feel hollowed out, scraped clean of everything that once made me human, filled instead with a cold efficiency that allows me to function when functioning should be impossible. Varro's sisters had dark hair and gap-toothed smiles. I remembered that much, at least. I remembered it as I moved to the next patient, as I assessed wounds and administered stims and made the calculations that determined who would see another dawn. I did not remember their names. I could not afford to remember their names. The next patient was already screaming. His name was Kellen, and his left leg was gone below the knee, and the tourniquet someone had applied in the field was the only thing keeping him from bleeding out in the seconds it took me to reach him. He was young. They were all young, these soldiers the Imperium fed into its endless wars. Boys barely old enough to shave, sent to die on worlds they could not pronounce for reasons they would never understand. His face was pale with shock. his eyes wide and rolling, his mouth open in a continuous scream that had become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. I knelt beside him. I checked the tourniquet, tight enough, properly placed, the work of someone who had paid attention during basic field medicine. I looked at the stump where his leg had been and I calculated. Survivable if infection did not set in, if the evacuation came in time, if the Imperium decided that a one-legged soldier was worth the resources required to keep him alive. "You're going to live," I told him, and I did not know if it was truth or lie, and I had stopped caring about the difference. "The leg is gone, but you're going to live. Do you understand me? Nod if you understand." He nodded. The screaming subsided to a whimper, then to a series of ragged breaths that shook his entire body. I administered a dose of Morpholox, half the recommended amount, because my supplies were running low and there were 16 more wounded waiting, and watched his face slacken as the pain retreated to something merely agonizing rather than unbearable. "What's your name, soldier?" "Kellen." The word came out slurred, thick with drugs and shock. "Kellen Voss, 3rd Platoon." "Kellen, I need you to stay awake. Can you do that? I need you to keep talking to me while I work." He nodded again, and I moved to the next wound, a deep gash across his ribs where shrapnel had torn through his flak armor and opened the flesh beneath. Not fatal, but ugly, requiring stitches I did not have time to make properly. I cleaned the wound with counterseptic that burned, and Kellen hissed through his teeth, and I closed the gash with surgical staples that would leave scars like railroad tracks across his torso. "Tell me about home," I said. "Where are you from, Kellen?" He talked. They always talked. When the drugs took hold, and the pain faded, and the fear of death loosened its grip just enough to let words escape. He told me about a hive world called Malthus Prime, about a hab block 17 levels down where his mother still lived, about a girl named Senna who had promised to wait for him, about a life that seemed impossibly distant from this mud and blood and screaming. I listened with half my attention while my hands worked. This was the secret they did not teach at the Medici Collegium, that a medic's voice could be as powerful as any drug, that the simple act of asking questions and hearing answers could keep a man tethered to life when his body wanted nothing more than to slip away into the darkness. I had learned it in the field, had discovered it by accident when a dying soldier had grabbed my wrist and begged me to let him tell me about his son. And I had listened, and he had lived long enough for the evacuation to arrive, and I had added the technique to my arsenal alongside sutures and stims and the cold mathematics of triage. "She has red hair," Kellen was saying, his voice dreamy now, floating on the Morpholox. "Senna, red hair and freckles. She works in the water reclamation plant. I'm going to marry her when I get home. I already asked her father." "That's good, Kellen. That's something to live for. You hold on to that." I finished with his ribs and moved to a secondary wound on his shoulder, smaller, less urgent, but still requiring attention. Behind me, I heard the moans of the other wounded, the prayers of those who still believed, the wet breathing of those who would not survive the next hour. I heard Corporal Vasquez, my assistant, moving among them with what few supplies we had left, making the same calculations I made, choosing the same deaths I chose. We had been assigned to the 47th Crawken Rifles 8 months ago, Vasquez and I. She had been a civilian nurse on a forge world before the draft took her, had learned medicine in hospitals where supplies were adequate, and patients arrived one at a time rather than in waves of screaming, bleeding flesh. The first week had nearly broken her. I had found her vomiting behind a ruined chimera after our first major engagement, her hands shaking so badly she could not hold a suture needle, her eyes carrying the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had seen too much too quickly. I had taught her what the Collegium had not. I had taught her to breathe through the horror, to focus on the wound in front of her rather than the wounds she could not reach, to build walls inside her mind that kept the dying on one side and her sanity on the other. I had taught her triage, not the theory, which she already knew, but the practice, the brutal reality of looking at a man who was begging for help and walking past him because the man beside him had better odds. She had learned. She had become good at it, almost as good as me. And sometimes I caught her looking at her own hands with the same hollow expression I saw in my mirror each morning. I had made her into what I was. I did not know whether to be proud or ashamed. "Medic!" The voice cut through the din, sharp with authority. "Medic, over here. Now!" I looked up and saw Sergeant Krell waving at me from across the triage area. He was standing over a body, an officer, I realized, a lieutenant whose name I should have known but could not remember. The officer was not moving, and even from this distance I could see the dark stain spreading across his chest, could see the particular stillness that separated the unconscious from the dead. "Vasquez, finish with this one," I said, rising from Kellen's side. "Morpholox in 30 minutes if the evac hasn't arrived. Watch the tourniquet." She nodded without looking up, her hands already moving to take my place, her focus narrowing to the patient in front of her the way I had taught her. I crossed the triage area in quick strides, weaving between the wounded who lay in rows on the muddy ground, their eyes following me with hope or despair, or the blank incomprehension of those who had already begun to die. The lieutenant was worse than I had thought. A bolter round had taken him through the chest. Not a lass bolt, not shrapnel, but the mass-reactive ammunition of the traitor legions, designed to penetrate armor and detonate inside the flesh. The wound was catastrophic. His chest cavity had been turned into a ruin of shattered bone and pulped organs, and the only reason he still breathed was that the round had somehow missed his heart, had destroyed everything around it while leaving the muscle itself intact. He should have been dead. By every medical principle I had been taught, he should have died the instant that round entered his body. But his heart was still beating. His lungs were still trying to draw air through passages that no longer existed. And his eyes, when I leaned close, were open, aware, filled with a terror that no amount of Morpholox could touch. "Save him!" Sergeant Krell's voice was flat, empty of everything except command. "That's Lieutenant Corvain. He's the only officer we have left. Save him." I looked at the wound. I looked at my supplies. 3 doses of counterseptic, 2 ampules of coagulant, a handful of surgical staples and sutures that would not begin to address the devastation before me. I looked at the 16 other wounded still waiting for treatment, men whose injuries were survivable, men who would die if I devoted my dwindling resources to a case that was already lost. The mathematics were clear. The mathematics were always clear. I can't. The words felt like stones in my mouth. The wound is fatal. There's nothing I can do. I didn't ask what you can do. Krell's hand found my shoulder, his grip tight enough to bruise. I told you to save him. He's our commanding officer. Without him, the company falls apart. Without him, we all die. So you are going to save him, medic, or I will put a bolt through your skull and find someone who will. I looked into Krell's eyes and saw something I had seen before, in the eyes of men who had been pushed past their breaking point. He meant it. He would kill me if I refused. He would kill me and feel nothing, because the war had already killed everything inside him that might have objected. Behind me, The other wounded continued to moan and pray and die. Kellen was still alive. I could hear his drugged voice mumbling about red hair and water reclamation plants. Vasquez was working, her hands steady, her focus absolute. The world continued to turn, the war continued to rage, and I stood at the center of an impossible choice with a gun at my back and a dying man at my feet. I knelt beside Lieutenant Corvain. I opened my kit. I began to work. I do not know how long it took. Time behaves strangely in moments of crisis, stretching and compressing in ways that defy measurement. I worked with everything I had, every technique I had learned, every trick I had discovered, every prayer I could not bring myself to speak aloud. I packed the wound with coagulant until my supply was exhausted. I sutured what could be sutured, stapled what could be stapled, improvised with strips of cloth and pieces of debris when my proper materials ran out. The lieutenant died anyway. He died with my hands inside his chest, died while I was trying to massage his heart back into rhythm, died with his eyes locked on mine and his mouth forming words that I could not hear over the ringing in my ears. One moment he was there, present, aware, fighting, and the next he was gone, the light leaving his eyes like water draining from a broken vessel. I withdrew my hands. I sat back on my heels. I looked at the blood that covered me from elbow to fingertip, that had soaked through my uniform and into my skin, that I would never entirely wash away no matter how hard I scrubbed. 3 men died while I worked on Lieutenant Corvain. 3 men whose wounds had been survivable, whose lives I could have saved if I had not wasted my supplies and my time on a corpse that refused to stop breathing. I learned their names later from the casualty reports that were filed after every engagement. Dren Holt, age 22. Mikhail Sorn, age 31. Yulen Karst, age 19. 3 names, 3 men, 3 deaths that I could have prevented. The mathematics haunted me. 3 lives weighed against one that was already lost. One that I had been ordered to save at gunpoint. One that had consumed resources that could have preserved something rather than delaying nothing. Sergeant Krell did not apologize. He did not acknowledge the men who had died while I followed his orders. He simply looked at the lieutenant's body, spat into the mud, and walked away to organize what remained of the company. I knelt in the blood and the filth, and I stared at my hands, and I understood that I had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. I had let 3 men die to follow an order that I knew was wrong. I had chosen obedience over mathematics. I did not know which was worse, the deaths themselves, or the realization that I would make the same choice again if a gun was pressed to my head, that I had become the kind of man who needed a gun to do the wrong thing, but who would do it nonetheless. The evacuation Valkyries arrived 20 minutes later. Kellen survived. 8 others survived. The rest were loaded into body bags and stacked in the cargo hold like cordwood, anonymous in death, their names reduced to entries in a ledger that no one would ever read. I climbed aboard the last Valkyrie with Vasquez at my side, and I did not look back at the field where we had worked, at the blood that had soaked into the mud, at the place where 3 men had died, because I had not been strong enough to say no. The engines roared, the ground fell away, and I closed my eyes and tried to remember what it had felt like to believe that I was saving lives. The memory would not come. It had been too long. The 47th Kraken Rifles had numbered 3,000 soldiers when I joined them. 9 months later, we were down to 412. I knew the number exactly because I had watched it shrink, engagement by engagement, casualty report by casualty report, name by name crossed off the roster until what remained was not a regiment, but a remnant. A collection of survivors held together by habit and hatred and the simple absence of anywhere else to go. I had treated over 2,000 wounded in those 9 months. I had saved perhaps 600. The rest had died. On my table, in transit, in the hours and days after I had done everything I could and found it insufficient. I had calculated the ratio once, late at night, when sleep would not come, and the faces of the dead pressed close against the walls of my consciousness. 30%. I saved 30% of the men who passed through my hands. The Medicae Collegium had taught us to expect 60% in field conditions. They had called it the acceptable threshold, the minimum survival rate that a competent medic should achieve with proper supplies and adequate support. Below 60%, they had told us, and you were failing. Below 60%, and you needed additional training, additional resources, additional faith in the Emperor's mercy. I was half of acceptable. I was failing by every metric the Collegium had established. But the Collegium had never served with the 47th Kraken Rifles. The Collegium had never worked in conditions where proper supplies meant whatever you could scavenge from the dead, and adequate support meant Vasquez and a prayer. The Collegium had never made the choices I made, had never felt the weight of mathematics that had no good answers, had never learned that 60% was a fantasy told to students who had not yet seen what war truly was. I stopped counting after that night. I stopped calculating ratios and percentages and survival rates. I simply worked, patient after patient, wound after wound, until the work was done, or I collapsed, or the enemy overran our position and rendered the question moot. Vasquez noticed the change. She noticed everything, had developed the same hyper-awareness that all survivors developed, the constant vigilance that kept you alive in an environment designed to kill you. "You're different," she said one evening, as we sat in the ruins of a hab block and cleaned our instruments by the light of a single lumen globe. "Since the lieutenant, you're different." I did not answer. I focused on the scalpel in my hands, on the blood that had dried in the grooves of its handle, on the mechanical process of scrubbing it clean. "Druce," her voice was soft, careful, the voice of someone approaching a wounded animal. "Talk to me. What happened out there?" "3 men died." The words came out flat, empty, stripped of everything except fact. 3 men died because I followed an order I knew was wrong. That's what happened. You didn't have a choice. Krell had a gun to your head. There's always a choice. I set the scalpel down and looked at her, and I saw her flinch at whatever she saw in my eyes. I could have refused. I could have let him shoot me and trusted you to save the men I couldn't. I could have done the right thing and died for it. Instead, I did the wrong thing and lived. That's not... It is. I picked up another instrument, a pair of forceps crusted with dried blood. That's exactly what it is. And the worst part, the part that keeps me awake at night, is that I would do it again. Given the same choice, I would make the same decision. Because I am a coward, Vasquez. Because I want to live more than I want to be right. And now, 3 men are dead because of what I want. She was quiet for a long time. The lumen globe flickered, casting shadows that jumped and danced across the ruined walls. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled. Ours or theirs, I could no longer tell the difference. "You're not a coward," she said finally. "You're a survivor. There's a difference." I laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "Is there? Tell that to Drenholt. Tell that to Mikael Sorn. Tell that to Yullencast. Tell them the difference between cowardice and survival, while they rot in a mass grave on a world whose name we've already forgotten. She did not respond. There was nothing to say. We finished cleaning our instruments in silence, and then we slept, or tried to sleep, lying on opposite sides of the ruined room, listening to the sounds of a war that never stopped, dreaming of blood and screaming, and the faces of men we could not save. The next engagement came 3 days later. It was worse than the others. They were all worse than the others, each battle finding new ways to destroy human bodies, new configurations of wound and trauma that I had never seen and hoped never to see again. The enemy had brought flamers this time, weapons that turned men into torches, that melted flesh and fused bone and created injuries so catastrophic that death was a mercy I dispensed with increasing frequency. I lost count of how many men I treated that day. I lost count of how many I saved and how many I lost. I remember only fragments, a soldier whose face had been burned away, his mouth still moving, still trying to speak through lips that no longer existed. A boy who could not have been more than 16, cradling the blackened ruin of his hands in his lap, asking me over and over if he would ever hold a rifle again. Vasquez working beside me, her movements quick and efficient, her eyes carrying the same emptiness I felt in my own chest. I remember Kellen. He had survived the previous engagement, had been evacuated to a field hospital where proper surgeons had done what they could with his leg. They had fitted him with a crude prosthetic, a mechanical limb that whirred and clicked when he walked, that marked him as damaged, diminished, no longer whole. But he had returned to the front. The Imperium did not waste soldiers who could still hold a rifle, and Kellen could still hold a rifle, even if he could no longer run or march or do any of the 1,000 things that legs were meant for. He found me in the aftermath of the battle, limping through the carnage with his mechanical leg leaving strange tracks in the blood-soaked mud. His face was grey with pain and exhaustion, but he was smiling. A small smile, fragile and uncertain, but real. "Medic," he said, "I wanted to thank you for saving my life. I never got the chance before." I looked at him, at his prosthetic leg, at the scars that crossed his ribs where I had stapled him together, at the haunted look in his eyes that had not been there before his wounding. And I felt something stir in the hollow space where my emotions had once lived. Not joy, not satisfaction, something smaller, quieter, harder to name. "You saved yourself," I said. "I just kept you alive long enough for the evacuation to arrive." "Same thing, isn't it?" He shifted his weight, wincing as his prosthetic whirred in protest. "I'm going to see Senna again. Because of you. I'm going to marry her and have children and live a life. Because you chose to save me when you could have chosen someone else." I thought of the calculations I had made that day. I thought of the men I had passed by to reach him, the wounds I had assessed and dismissed as unsurvivable, the choices that had led me to his side rather than someone else's. Had I saved him because his odds were better, or because he had been talking about red hair and water reclamation plants? Because he had reminded me that the bodies I treated were people with lives and hopes and futures? I did not know. I would never know. "Go back to your squad, Kellen," I said. "Stay alive. Make it home to Senna." He nodded and limped away, his mechanical leg clicking against the mud, his silhouette shrinking until he was just another figure among the hundreds that moved through the aftermath of battle. I watched him go, and I tried to feel something. Pride, perhaps, or hope, or the sense of purpose that I had once found in this work. The hollow space remained hollow. 3 weeks later, Kellen was dead. An artillery shell had landed on his position during a night bombardment, killing him and 6 others instantly. I learned about it from the casualty report, a single line among dozens. His name reduced to letters on a page. Kellen Voss, 3rd Platoon, killed in action. I did not weep for him. I had no tears left to weep. I simply read his name and moved on to the next, and the next, and the next, until the report was finished and I could file it away with all the others. All the names, all the deaths, all the mathematics that never balanced no matter how hard I tried. Senna would never know why her letters stopped being answered. Senna would wait for a man who was never coming home. And eventually, she would stop waiting. And eventually, she would forget. And eventually, Kellen Voss would become nothing more than a memory that faded year by year until only the faintest impression remained. This is what war does. This is what the Guard does. It takes bright young men with red-haired girls waiting for them, and it grinds them into numbers on casualty reports, and it asks medics like me to delay that grinding for as long as possible, knowing that the delay is temporary, knowing that the machine will claim them eventually, knowing that every life we save is merely a loan that will be repaid with interest. The regiment continued to shrink. 400 became 300. 300 became 200. We were reinforced twice. Raw conscripts shipped in from worlds that had never known war. Green soldiers who died faster than I could learn their names. I stopped trying to learn their names. I simply treated their wounds and calculated their odds and moved on. A machine processing meat. A cog in a mechanism that existed only to feed other cogs into the fire. Vasquez died on the 73rd day. It was a stupid death, a random death, the kind of death that war dispenses without meaning or purpose. A stray Lasbolt during a firefight that should not have touched the medical station, passing through the canvas of our tent and finding her chest with the precise cruelty of mathematics that cared nothing for fairness or justice. She was dead before she hit the ground, dead before I could reach her, dead with her hands still holding the sutures she had been preparing for our next patient. I knelt beside her body and I looked at her face, and I saw the peace that I had seen on so many faces, the particular stillness that came when the struggle finally ended. She had not suffered. The bolt had killed her instantly, had switched off her existence like a light being extinguished. One moment she had been there, and the next she had not, and the universe continued without her, as if she had never existed at all. I closed her eyes. I folded her hands across her chest. I spoke the words that the priests had taught us, the litany for the fallen, the prayer that committed her soul to the Emperor's keeping. Then I stood and I walked to the next patient, and I resumed my work. There was nothing else to do. There was no time to mourn, no space for grief, no luxury of feeling anything at all. There were wounded soldiers who needed treatment, calculations that needed to be made, deaths that needed to be chosen. I worked alone after that. The regiment was too depleted to spare another assistant, too desperate for soldiers who could hold rifles to waste one on medical support. I managed as best I could, prioritizing ruthlessly, cutting corners that should never have been cut, saving some and losing others, and trying not to think about the difference. The hollow space inside me grew larger. It consumed the parts of myself that I had once valued: compassion, empathy, the belief that individual lives had meaning. What remained was something harder, colder, more efficient. Something that could look at a dying man and feel nothing except the calculation of resources, the weighing of odds, the mathematics that determined whether he lived or died. I had become what the Guard needed me to become. I had become a machine that processed casualties, a tool that the Imperium wielded without concern for the damage it did to itself. I did not know if there was anything left inside me that was still human. I was not certain I wanted to find out. The final battle came on the 91st day. I did not know it was the final battle when it began. Every battle felt final when you were in the middle of it. Every engagement carrying the weight of extinction. Every firefight promising to be the one that ended everything. But this one was different. This one had a quality that I had learned to recognize over 9 months of constant warfare. A desperation in the enemy's assault, a ferocity in our defense, a sense that whatever happened in the next few hours would determine the fate of everyone still breathing. The 47th Kraken Rifles had been reduced to 117 soldiers. 117, from an original strength of 3,000. We held a position on the outskirts of a city whose name I had never learned. A cluster of ruined buildings that commanded a crossroads the enemy needed, and we had been ordered to deny them. There was no retreat. There was no reinforcement. There was only the position and the enemy, and the certain knowledge that most of us would not survive the day. I set up my medical station in the basement of a building that had once been a skolum, its walls still decorated with faded murals of saints and martyrs, its floors still scattered with the debris of childhoods interrupted by war. The irony was not lost on me. Treating the wounded in a place where children had once learned to read, saving lives in a room where young minds had once been filled with hope and possibility. But I had no time for irony. I had no time for anything except preparation. I counted my supplies. 3 doses of Morpholox, 7 ampules of coagulant, a handful of bandages, most of them already used and re-sterilized until the fabric was grey with age. Surgical tools that had been designed for a single use and were now on their 15th or 20th. A prayer to the Emperor that I no longer believed but spoke anyway, because ritual was all I had left. The attack began at dawn. I heard it before I saw it. The scream of artillery, the roar of engines, the staccato thunder of heavy weapons opening up along our perimeter. The building shook. Dust rained from the ceiling. The murals of saints and martyrs cracked and flaked, their painted faces crumbling as the violence outside pressed in. Then the wounded started arriving. They came in waves, carried by comrades or dragging themselves through the rubble, their bodies torn open by weapons that had been designed to kill and had succeeded only in maiming. I worked without thought, without feeling, my hands moving through the familiar motions of assessment and treatment, while my mind retreated to that distant place where the screaming could not reach it. Las burns, shrapnel wounds. A man whose arm had been severed by something I did not want to identify. A boy, another boy, they were always boys, whose intestines were spilling through a hole in his abdomen, whose eyes found mine with a question I could not answer. I made the calculations. I chose the deaths. I saved who I could and abandoned who I couldn't, and the pile of bodies in the corner of the basement grew higher with each hour that passed. The enemy breached our perimeter in the 4th hour. I heard the change in the gunfire, closer now, more frantic, punctuated by the screams of men dying in close combat rather than at range. The wounded stopped arriving. The soldiers who had been carrying them were needed on the line, were fighting with bayonets and bare hands against an enemy that poured through the gaps in our defense like water through a broken dam. I should have stayed in the basement. I should have continued treating the wounded who remained, should have focused on the work that I had been trained to do. But something moved in me, something that I had thought was dead, something that stirred in the hollow space where my humanity had once lived. I picked up a laser gun. I did not know whose it was. One of the dead, probably. One of the bodies that lay stacked in the corner. I checked the charge, found it half full, and I climbed the stairs toward the sound of fighting. The world outside was chaos. Bodies lay everywhere, ours and theirs, tangled together in the intimate embrace of violent death. Last fire crisscrossed the ruins, tracing lines of light through the smoke and dust that choked the air. I saw soldiers I recognized, faces I had treated, wounds I had stitched, men I had saved, fighting and dying in the rubble of a city that had already been destroyed. I raised my laser gun. I fired. I do not know if I hit anything. I do not know if the bolts I sent into the chaos found flesh or simply vanished into the smoke. I only know that I fired, again and again, until the charge was exhausted and the weapon was nothing but dead weight in my hands. And then I saw him. He was young, younger than Kellen, younger than Varro, younger than any soldier had a right to be. He lay in a crater, perhaps 20 meters from where I stood, his body twisted at an angle that spoke of a fall, his uniform soaked with blood that might have been his own, or might have belonged to someone else. He was alive. I could see his chest rising and falling, could see his hands clawing weakly at the mud, could see his mouth opening and closing in words that the distance swallowed. The enemy was between us. A squad of them moving through the ruins with the methodical efficiency of soldiers who knew they were winning. They had not seen me yet. They had not seen him. But they would. In seconds, they would reach his position, and they would finish what their weapons had started, and he would become another name on a casualty report that no one would ever read. The mathematics were clear. The boy was beyond my reach. The enemy was too numerous, too well armed, too close. If I moved from my position, I would die. If I stayed, he would die. There was no calculation that produced a different outcome. I moved anyway. I do not remember crossing the distance between us. I do not remember the last bolts that screamed past my head, the shouts of the enemy soldiers who saw me and opened fire, the pain that erupted in my shoulder as one of their shots found its mark. I remember only the boy's face as I reached him, the surprise in his eyes, the way his hand found mine and gripped it with a strength that his wounds should not have permitted. "Medic," he whispered. "Medic, I don't want to die." The words hit me like a physical blow. I had heard them before, from Varro, from Kellen, from 100 other soldiers whose names I had forgotten and whose faces I would carry forever. The same words, the same fear, the same desperate hope that someone, somehow, might be able to hold back the darkness that was pressing in from all sides. "You're not going to die," I said, and for the first time in months, I meant it. "I'm going to get you out of here. Do you understand? I'm going to save you." I pulled him onto my back. The pain in my shoulder screamed in protest, but I ignored it. Pain was just information, just data to be processed and set aside. I staggered to my feet, the boy's weight threatening to drive me back down, and I began to move. The enemy saw us. They fired. I felt impacts against the rubble around me, felt the heat of near misses that should have killed me but didn't. I kept moving. One step, then another, my legs burning, my lungs screaming, my vision narrowing until all I could see was the doorway ahead, the basement stairs, the safety that might not exist, but that I had to believe in anyway. I made it. I do not know how. The mathematics said I should have died. The calculations said the enemy's fire should have found me, should have cut me down before I crossed half the distance. But mathematics does not account for luck or desperation, or the particular madness that seizes men in the final moments of a losing battle. I carried the boy down the stairs and laid him on the floor of the basement, and I looked at his wound for the first time, and I understood that everything I had said was a lie. The damage was catastrophic. A bolt round had taken him through the abdomen. Not a las bolt, but a bolt round. The same weapon that had killed Lieutenant Corvain. The same mass-reactive ammunition that destroyed everything it touched. His organs were pulped. His spine was shattered. The blood that poured from him was not the bright red of arterial bleeding, but the dark, almost black flow of internal hemorrhage that no amount of medicine could stop. He was dying. He had been dying since the moment the round hit him, and I had carried him through enemy fire, had risked my life to save his, had promised him that he would not die. And now I knelt beside him with empty hands and emptier promises, watching the light fade from his eyes. Am I going to make it? His voice was barely audible, a whisper that I felt more than heard. Medic, am I going to make it? I looked at him. I looked at the wound that I could not treat, the damage that I could not repair, the death that I could not prevent. I thought of all the lies I had told, to patients, to myself, to the universe that seemed to take pleasure in making my work meaningless. I thought of Vasquez, who had called me a survivor rather than a coward. I thought of Kellen, who had thanked me for saving a life that war had claimed 3 weeks later. I thought of the mathematics, the cold calculations that had governed my existence for 9 months, the numbers that reduced men to probabilities and lives to resource allocation. And I made a choice. Yes, I said. I took his hand in mine, and I held it tight, and I looked into his eyes, and I lied with everything I had. Yes, you're going to make it. You're going to be fine. The evacuation is coming. They're going to take you to a hospital, and they're going to fix you up, and you're going to go home. Do you hear me? You're going home. He smiled. It was a small smile, fragile and fading, but real. Home, he whispered. I'd like that. I'd like to go home. Tell me about it, I said. Tell me about home. He talked. His voice grew weaker with each word, his grip on my hand loosening as the life drained out of him. But he talked. He told me about a farm on a world called Prestis IV, about fields of golden grain that stretched to the horizon, about a mother who made bread and a father who sang while he worked, about a dog named Rust who had slept at the foot of his bed every night until the draft took him away. I listened. I held his hand. I watched him die, slowly, peacefully, with a smile on his face and a lie on his lips. His name was Corden. He was 17 years old. He had wanted to be a farmer like his father. When his breathing stopped, I did not move. I knelt beside his body, and I held his hand, and I wept. The first tears I had shed since Torren, since the first man I had lost, since the day I had sworn to never lose another patient. The tears fell on Corden's face, on the smile that death had not erased, and I let them fall, because there was no one left to see, no one left to judge, no one left to remind me that medics did not have time for grief. The battle ended some time later. I do not know how much time passed, hours perhaps, or only minutes. Time had lost all meaning. I only know that at some point the gunfire stopped, and voices called out in Gothic rather than the enemy's tongue, and boots descended the stairs to find me still kneeling beside a boy who had wanted to go home. They told me later that we had won. The enemy had been repelled. The crossroads had been held. The 91 survivors of the 47th Crawken Rifles had accomplished their mission, had denied the enemy their objective, had proven once again that the Imperial Guard could endure anything the universe threw at it. 91 from 117. 26 more names for the casualty report. 26 more deaths to add to the thousands that had come before. They called it a victory. They said we should be proud. I felt nothing. The hollow space inside me had finally consumed everything else, had swallowed the tears and the grief and the memory of a boy named Corden who had wanted to be a farmer. What remained was not a man, but a shell, a thing that walked and spoke and breathed, but no longer understood why any of it mattered. I had crossed the killing ground to save a boy I could not save. I had lied to him while he died. I had held his hand and wept for the first time in months, and none of it had changed anything. The mathematics remained, the calculations remained, the war remained, and I remained, though I no longer knew what that meant. They reassigned me after Crethis. The 47th Kraken Rifles was officially dissolved. Too few survivors to reconstitute, too broken to rebuild. Those of us who remained were scattered across a dozen different regiments, our histories erased, our service records transferred to new units that did not know what we had been through and did not care to learn. I was sent to the 112th Vostroyan Firstborn as a replacement medic. New faces, new names, new soldiers who looked at me with the wary respect that veterans reserve for those who have seen more than they should have, who carry wounds that do not bleed but never heal. I did not tell them about the 47th. I did not tell them about Varro or Kellen or Vasquez or Corden. I did not tell them about the mathematics, about the calculations that had governed my existence, about the hollow space inside me that had consumed everything I once was. I simply worked, patient after patient, wound after wound. The same motions I had performed 10,000 times before, the same choices I had made until choosing had become as automatic as breathing. But something had changed. I noticed it first in the small moments. The extra second I spent holding a wounded soldier's hand, the questions I asked about homes and families and lives that existed beyond the war, the lies I told to dying men, not because the mathematics demanded it, but because the lies themselves had become a kind of medicine, a treatment for wounds that no surgery could reach. I noticed it in the way I looked at casualties, not as numbers to be processed, but as people to be mourned, each death carrying a weight that I no longer tried to set aside. I noticed it in the tears that came more easily now, in the prayers that I spoke with something approaching sincerity, in the hollow space that had begun, slowly, to fill with something I could not name. Corden had broken me, but perhaps breaking was not the same as ending. Perhaps the thing that emerged from the breaking was not worse than what had come before, but different, scarred, changed, diminished in some ways and expanded in others. I still make the calculations. I still choose who lives and who dies, still play God with lives that are not mine to give or take. The mathematics remain cold and indifferent and absolute. But I have learned that mathematics is not the whole of medicine, that numbers cannot capture everything that matters, that sometimes the most important thing a medic can do is hold a dying boy's hand and lie to him about going home. I carry them with me now. All of them, every name I remember and every name I have forgotten. Torren, who called me by his mother's name. Varro, whose sisters had dark hair and gap-toothed smiles. Kellen, who wanted to marry a girl named Senna. Vasquez, who taught me that survival and cowardice are not the same thing. Corden, who wanted to be a farmer. They are part of me. They always will be. The war continues. It will always continue. There will always be another battlefield, another triage station, Another wave of wounded soldiers screaming for help that I cannot give. There will always be more deaths than I can prevent, more mathematics than I can bear, more hollow spaces carved into whatever remains of my soul. But I will keep working. I will keep saving who I can and mourning who I cannot. I will keep lying to dying men, keep holding their hands, keep asking them about their homes and their families and their dreams, because that is what it means to be a medic in the Astra Militarum. Not to save every life, that is impossible. Not to feel nothing, that is inhuman. But to stand in the space between life and death, to fight for every breath, even when the mathematics say the fight is hopeless. To find meaning in the struggle itself rather than in its outcome. I do not know if I am still a good man. I do not know if I ever was. But I am still a medic, and tomorrow, when the guns begin again, I will be there. It is not redemption. It is not peace. But it is enough.